you have provocations all around you, including the company of others. Which, by the way, I think is one of the most powerful things that the Craftsman does as a book. It turns our attention away from this idea that the Craftsman is this weazened old individual
Right.
drilling down into a hole that
Right.
nobody else can get into,
Right.
but that suddenly he, at some point, presents this object which is so polished and honed that it is inaccessible but
Right.
for admiration.
Right.
And but what he does is he says, no, actually we're working with these problems and finding ways to, through the problems, to enhance our relationships with one another, our relationships with a larger society. And in the beginning of the second book, which is called Together, he introduces this body politic right away. So that the Craftsman is not this isolated human being,
Right.
but the Craftsman is the beginning of an establishment of communication.
Yeah. I wish that he had talked about Thoreau, because Thoreau's a really good example of this, where I don't know what he thought, but our story about him in the 21st century is that he embodies this solitude, the sovereignty of living by yourself and making all your own stuff. And isn't that good, to not depend on other people? But in fact, he did depend on other people. He had to go into town and get supplies and cooperate with his neighbors. And he didn't just do it out of necessity. That was a big part of his life, and what made his life meaningful.
I think you're underscoring something that is really important, just about understanding Thoreau and understanding Craftsman.
Yeah.
And that is that craftsmen are concepts that express a certain romance that we want to have.
Right.
Just as Thoreau is the expression of a certain romance that we want to have about individualism. But Thoreau's own stated intention was not about being individualistic. It was about appreciation.
Yeah.
It was about putting himself in a situation where he could begin to appreciate the practice of living.
Right. What we might today call mindfulness.
Indeed. And so I think that one of the wonderful contributions of Sennett's book is also this movement away from this certain kind of isolation,
right.
Or thinking about craftsmanship as a way of becoming insular, and seeing it instead as a way of enhancing communication. I think, I respond to that idea on several levels out of the text. One is, just simplistically put, one is the amount of time he spends talking about the craft of performing music, which is fundamentally a really profound communication.
Right.
And then the innovation that he adds to this notion of craftsmanship by including coding, which is another profound form of communication.
Right.
So that ultimately, what we're talking about is how we stay in touch with one another on all these many different levels.
Right. Right. Deep
connection. And by the way, as you know, this came up in our course with the coders. One of them, as you know, asked me why I was talking about music, and I reminded him that writing music was a form of coding. and, and so that made our conversation much easier then. Yeah.
Right. Because aren't you, this is in taiko. I used to play taiko, and there's a and we say taiko in English, but in Japanese that would be confusing. So we often say kumi taiko, which means ensemble drum. And and the philosophy there is that the musician plays the drum. The musician and the drum as a unit play the other members of the ensemble. And the ensemble as a unit plays the audience. So the audience is your instrument. You're presenting them with certain stimuli to elicit a certain response. And just like with the little pieces of tape, you can never be certain. You can be as precise as you want to be about the stimuli you give the audience, but you never know exactly how they're going to echo it back to you. And that is the point. That's what makes it art. That's what makes it interesting, because you're going to get something that you're going to get something that's bigger than what you put out there. The sum is greater than the whole of its parts. And so it's not just the coder and the computer, it's the coder and the computer and the user eventually. And it's the users and whatever they're doing with the code. Like they are paying money for this for a purpose. And what's that purpose what effect is that purpose going to have in the community? Like they're going to have cable TV now in this rural northwestern Bulgaria. And what are those grandmas going to do with the stuff that they see on cable? It's really, it keeps spreading out.
Right. Yeah, I just thought that, so I guess that really draws a line under how I feel about the Craftsman. In that there were a number of things that I was sort of
I was doing this a little bit.
Yeah.
Like, okay, you're talking about Mesopotamia now. You're talking about the ancient Greeks, Calvinism. I don't care about Calvinism.
Right. Well, it was interesting because that part was very interesting to me only because my father worked at IBM, and IBM has been, in those days, in the 1950s, was identified as a clearly Calvinistic.
I was thinking about jokes.
No,
big Calvinists, were they at IBM? In what way?
Yeah. Their work ethic and their worldview and their sense of historical determinism and all of those things. So I was fascinated by that, and both appreciative and troubled by the conversation, because I appreciate what was accomplished, but I was also troubled at the cost of that accomplishment. So.
Specifically with your dad, or talking about IBM, or talking
about IBM, talking about the way in which the terms in which computer technology advanced. All of that changed at the development of Silicon Valley, but,
which is a different story that it tells itself.
Yeah, it's a different story. But in those days, computer technology was about defeating Russia. And, no, seriously, because in fact, when the Soviet Union finally collapsed in the late 80s, IBM went through an enormous contraction. And I actually had, and several other artists I know, had contracts with New York State Department of Labor to work with IBM engineers to help them reimagine themselves
Yeah.
because they had worked within the bubble of IBM for their entire careers. So they couldn't think of themselves in any other way.